That's exactly what it means, right? They just didn't know. And so you think about that. Has God ever wanted his people to be unknowing? No, right? That's why there's the Bible. And in fact, isn't Hosea 4 and verse 6 that Hosea says, or God says through Hosea, that my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge, right? You go back to the beginning, look at Adam and Eve in the garden. And when Satan came to Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3, doesn't Satan confront Eve with the question, with the perspective that she knew what God said? You think about that. And that's a very important principle for us to understand. And so if you look at Genesis 3 and verse 1, now serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, has God indeed said? What do we know about that based on that statement? What do we know about the nature of God from that statement? It's early still. That's all right. Here's what we know about God. God's not going to punish someone who couldn't know or didn't know, right? Okay. If Satan showed up and said, I heard God said, and Eve said, well, I hadn't heard that yet. It would have been a totally different turn of events, right? But we know that God educated Adam and Eve on his law before there's any punishment, right? You get later on in the chapter, and Adam and Eve are condemned for what? Because, yeah, that's exactly right. And so God gives us an opportunity. Romans 1 talks about that. We've talked about that a little bit on Tuesday mornings as we started a study of kind of overview of some of the things in Romans. So we come back and we see 1 Corinthians 12. And Paul was writing to the church. And so he says, I don't want you to be ignorant concerning the spiritual blessings. And so at this time, and so we know that in 1 Corinthians, Paul dealt with a lot of different issues, right? And so when you get here, we talked about the different gifts, right? Wasn't there 9 gifts that we counted? Each one being a different gift, a unique gift, and not all the brethren. So we want to look at this in a little more detail. Let's jump ahead and look at 1 Corinthians 12, verse 12. For as the body is one, it has many members, but all the members of that one body, being many, are one body, so also is Christ. And so we've got to understand 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 12 correctly, because we understand that as the book of 1 Corinthians began, then Paul preached to them about unity, and we'll talk about this some in the sermon here in a little bit, about being the same mind and the same judgment. And so we're talking about a standard, the same standard being used, right? And so what's the standard? God's Word, okay? And if we use the same standard, are we going to have the same results? You know, probably an illustration that I always think about is if you go to Walmart and you buy an entertainment center, and it has a picture on the box of what the entertainment the center should look like. And you come home and you open up the directions and you go through all the steps of the directions. At the end of the process, what should that entertainment center look like?
Should look like a box.
Yeah. But you know, but this, you know, some people, the Bible, basic information before leaving earth, right? Anyway, kind of a catchy phrase to think about. So if we think about that way, if this is the instruction manual on how to build Christians or how to build the church, which it is, then when we look at the New Testament church and we look at New Testament Christians, what should we look like? You know, just this weekend, somebody made reference to churches, Christianity, in the broad sense, right, as far as our world standard. Talking about they're pretty much the same. And that was they said basically they're the same. You know, there's not much differences. Okay. So you go back and why does this matter? 1 Corinthians 12, verse 12, for as the body is one and has many members, but all the members of that one body being many are one body, so also is Christ. This is not talking about, and some people go to this and use this, say, this is what supports the denominational world today. Where we have all these different churches with all these different views, and they're all okay. That's not what he's talking about. Who are the individual members of the body here in verse 12? Yeah, the members, which are individuals, right? Not talking about denominations, talking about individuals. And so that's an important thing. So then in verse 13, Paul says, for by one Spirit we, who's the we? The church, right? Which is what? Individual members. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago when we went through this, is the idea of each one of us are individual, right? But we're all part of the body, okay, grouped together. So, by one Spirit, we were all baptized into one body, which is what? Matthew 16:18, where Jesus said, upon this rock I will build my, what? Not churches. What's he say? My church. Okay? So we understand that. Whether we're Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and have all been made to drink into one Spirit. You think about this, and we've talked about this again. We rush through it. How many of us have the same abilities? How many of us have the same opportunities? And what I mean by same opportunities is this. We all live in different places, for example, right? You have influence over people that I don't, just because of where you geographically live, right? Because of relationship, maybe with neighbors, friends from your area. And so when we look at this, we're all baptized in one Spirit. We're all baptized in one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and all have all been made to drink of that one Spirit. The apostles had unique characters, didn't they? Each one of them was unique. Did that help or hurt the church? Depends how they used it, right? Judas didn't necessarily help the church, but it depends how they used it. Paul, from Acts chapter 9, we know that he was a chosen vessel to bear Christ's name before who? The Gentiles, but then also those in authority. Why? Because he had the education, he had the training, he had the experience, he had the character that was needed to go to those people. Does that mean he was better than Peter? He was better. He just had a unique responsibility. And so when we start thinking in the church that, well, I'm not as good as so-and-so, or I don't have as much influence, or I'm not able to do, is that the case? Not at all. So we go on, verse 14. For in fact, the body is not one member, but many. If the foot shall say, because I am not the hand, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? And if the ear should say, because I am not the eye, I am not of the body, it is therefore not of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole were hearing, where would the smelling? But now God has set the members, each one of them, in the body just as he pleased, right? As we keep going, and hopefully we'll have more time this morning because we started over. But here's the thing. Who chose which members of the Lord's body got that special spiritual gift? When we think about the miraculous, we don't have that ability, the miraculous ability today, right? But how many of us have abilities? All of us have abilities, okay? And so if we were to go to study this morning about the parable of the talents, we're pretty familiar about that, right? Who gives the talents? You say, well, God does, right? But whose decision is it how many talents we get? Based upon our what? Our stewardship. Based upon our stewardship, God gives us more talents. I think about that 5-talent man in that illustration of the talents. Do you think he started as a 5-talent man? I don't want to read anything into it that's not there. But that 5-talent man showed a sense of maturity, right? Where's maturity come from? Experience. Experience and wisdom, right? Did he start as a 5-talent man? I don't think so. And so the problem was the 1-talent man didn't want to excel past where he was at. He didn't want to even excel to the point where he should be, right? And so we think about that. So we go back here and we think about the body and how it works together. We're many members, verse 14, and all of us are important, right? So we go to verse 18, but now God has set the members, each one of them in the body, just as what? He pleased. Okay. This is, we need to look at this, I feel like, from two sides. One is, we can only be as good of a steward as we choose to be, right? God won't force us to be a better Christian than we want to be. In fact, God won't force us to be a Christian. He doesn't force salvation upon us. But He will use us in the way that He sees we're going to be used the best, right? John the Baptist, if we were to talk about John the Baptist, was there anything special about John before he was born? Is anybody familiar with that account?
He was determined before he was born. I mean, God had already determined his path.
Yeah. Go to Jeremiah 1. Jeremiah 1. Jeremiah 1, it's interesting to me, and we think about this in the church, because we're not God, we don't think the same as God, we don't understand quite as well as God does, right? Not even close in all reality. When Jesus went to the cross, did God make Jesus go to the cross? That was what was going to happen, and it was told about in prophecy. God didn't make it happen. Those people, because of their free moral agency, were going to do that anyway. But God knew about it, so He said, I'll use this opportunity with Christ in that position to wash away the sins of the world. So in Jeremiah 1, we'll start in verse 1. It says, the words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were of Anath of the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah the son of Ammon, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. It came also in the days of Jehoiakim the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the end of the 11th year of Zedekiah the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the carrying away of Jerusalem captive in the 5th month. Verse 4, pay attention. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I did what? Okay, that's an important principle. When we think about John the Baptist, we think about Moses, we think about ourselves. What did God choose him? Did He force him, or did He know him? One thing that people have a problem with, and this is kind of a side note, but I want us to realize that God knows how He can use us based on who we are. God doesn't choose who we are. God chooses to use us based upon who we are. And so when we think about John the Baptist, or baptizer, remember when the babe leaped in her womb, right? Why was that? Okay, because God gave, right. I don't want to misword that. God knew who John the Baptist was going to be. So before he was an adult, before he started doing what he was doing, God said, well, I'm going to give you a help, right?
What's consecrate?
Consecrate?
I might do
That's to set apart, it's for a special purpose. So He said, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart, sanctified you. I ordered you a prophet to the nations. Why did God choose Noah, or not, Noah as an example, or Moses? Why did God choose them? Because He knew who they were and said, I can use you for this purpose. And so here with Jeremiah, God says, I knew you before you were born. Therefore, you keep on going. Then said I, O Lord God, behold, I cannot speak, for I am a youth. But the Lord said to me, do not say, I am a youth. For you shall go to all whom I send you, and whatever I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of their faces, for I am with you to deliver you, says the Lord. Jeremiah, very similar to what Moses at the bush. What did Moses say? He said, this mission is not for me, God. What's Jeremiah say? I'm not ready for this task. This mission isn't for me. God says hold your peace. He says, you got to do this. This is your job. This is your mission. So you go back and we think about 1 Corinthians 12 and what's being said here in verse 18. But now God has set the members, each one of them, in the body just as he pleased. Right? What's that mean? That means you're needed in this congregation because you have a purpose. Now, the question we need to ask ourselves is, am I fulfilling the fullness of my purpose? Right? Am I feeling the fullness of my purpose? Am I using all of my potential? Are there some times in people's lives of anybody in the Bible that we read about that they weren't living up to their full potential? Any examples?
Every time. We
Probably.
fail at that.
Yeah, we can probably. Think about Esther, and I know Eric's studying Esther. In chapter 4, isn't it Mordecai that tells her? He says, suppose it's God has set you here for such a time as this. What was Mordecai urging her to do? Make sure she was living up to her full potential, right?
I don't think she realized until it's pointed out to her. So what I'm saying is that sometimes we don't realize what our purpose is.
Until someone points it out.
You know?
Are you waiting or you pointing it out? That's
I don't know, I can
okay. That's
make
good.
it happen.
And take people with you. That's our purpose. So verse 19, if they were all members, if they were all one member, where would the body be? What does it mean by one member? The same member. If we were the same, doing the same thing, right? Just like right now. I'm not better than you because I'm teaching Bible class. No way at all. But this is my time to be here, right? But where would the Bible class be if we weren't here to study together? Same thing, right? And that's one thing we think about, how important people are in pews, right? How important are people in pews? Because a lot of times we say, well, the preacher, song leader, those are the important ones. They're not. I mean, they are, but we're all just as important, right? You think about, does it encourage us when people aren't here? You say, well, brother and sister so-and-so aren't here. That's encouraging. If that happens, there's a problem, another problem, right? That's not encouraging, right? There's no edification in that. In fact, Paul in Romans 16 tells them to salute one another with what? A holy kiss, a greeting. That means they have to be present for that to happen. And so that means if I'm not here to greet someone, then I can't fulfill the greeting, right? And if they're not here to be greeted, then they can't fulfill their part. All right, so we keep on going. Verse 20. But now indeed there are many members, yet one body, and the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor the head of the feet, I have no need of you. No, much rather those members of the body which seem to be weaker are what? Necessary, right? Verse 22, those members of the body which appear or seem to be weaker are necessary. Is it our job to point out a part we think is weaker? To build them up, right? And so if I have an injury or sickness or weakness in my body, what does it affect? The whole body, right? And so me as my body, when I see that part, should I look down on it and degrade that part? What do I try to do? build up and fix it, right? And sometimes the body, we feel like individuals, right? And when we're going through a time, maybe when we're weak, it affects the body, right? But sometimes the body, we want to do what with it? Outcast it. And 1 Corinthians 5, there's a time for that, right? But that's when someone is living a lifestyle of sin and choosing to stay that way, not when they're weak or struggling, okay? You think about that word struggling. What's it mean when you're struggling? You ever thought about that? That means you're still trying. So, as Christians, how many of us still have struggles? 1 Corinthians 5 is talking about an individual that's not struggling, trying to get rid of sin, right? He just accepted sin. That's the difference, right? He's drowning in his sin. Okay. Questions or comments? Clear as mud? Okay.
I think almost all of us as Christians, if we're trying to follow God, we're struggling.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I don't think we can say we're not struggling because we have to, even if we're strong, we still struggle
Mm-hmm.
with things.
Yeah. And when we quit struggling, that's the problem, right? Yeah, absolutely. I heard one man, an older man, that when he's a preacher, when you look at him, you say, boy, that guy, he's got it all figured out. And he said, every time I work and I feel like I overcome one hurdle in my Christian life, he says, I just get over the hump and there's the next one. He says it's just constant. You know? And so you just stick with it. Let's jump ahead to verse 26. I don't want to spend too much time that we don't get where we need to head. Verse 26, if one member suffers, all the members do what? I think that's one of the things we struggle with in the church. Would you agree or disagree? You say, my problems are my problems, so leave me alone during my problems. And your problems are your problems, so don't bother me with your problems. How many of us have been guilty of that? Well, I guess we're all right. Now we're going to study lying. Anyway, no. Yeah, we do. Right? Think about that. And again, the church should be our closest family, right? And family, somehow by nature, family will accept any and all of our weaknesses and imperfections and overlook that, right? And not that we should overlook it as Christians, but as far as we take someone in who's going through a difficult time, we say, okay, we're going to nurse you back to Christian health. Why? Because the body depends on it, okay? We talked about verse 27. Now you're of the body of Christ and members individual, right? We're particular or special. So, verse 28, God has appointed these in the church, first apostles, second prophets, third teachers. After that, miracles and gifts of healing, helps, administrations, varieties of tongues. Are all apostles, are all prophets, are all preachers, all workers of miracles? Do all have the gift of healing? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? But earnestly desire the best gifts, and yet I show you a more excellent way. Now, again, the context of 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14 is the struggle in the congregation about everyone wanting to have the best gift, the best miraculous gift. Who knows what that was? Chapter 14 tells us. They wanted to be able to speak in tongues. Yep. And so Paul says, he asks the question, do all have the same gifts? But then he says, desire the best gifts. But he doesn't tell us what the best gift is till we get to verse 14, or chapter 14. We talked about that a couple weeks ago because we condensed the end of this. But then when we come to chapter 13 we always talk about as the chapter of love, right? I think it's the chapter where the word agape is used more than any other chapter in the Bible. And what is agape love? Unconditional, right? It's the deepest form of love that we can have. In fact, when you get to 2 Peter chapter 1, when we talk about those 8 Christian virtues or graces that we add, then you have brotherly kindness, which is phileo, and to our brotherly kindness we need to add what? Charity in the King James, or agape love, because that's the hardest one to get to perfect. It's easy for us to have a love towards our brethren, right? Like a fraternal love, because, well, we think alike, we look alike, we act alike, we are alike, and so because you're my brother or kindred, I'm going to love you. And it's talking about Christian brothers and sisters in that context. But it's harder to love who? Everyone. So Paul says the problem in the congregation was they lacked love. So let's look at the first 2 verses of 1 Corinthians 13. He said, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not love, I am become a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I can remove mountains, and have not love, I am nothing. The first verse, what gift does he mention out of the 9? Yeah, the gift of tongues. What was the gift that everyone coveted? Yeah, the gift of tongues, right? The ability to speak in a foreign language. That's what it is. We know that from Acts chapter 2. It wasn't an unknown religious language, as some people say, or a garble. What was it? It was being able to speak to others in another language. And so Paul says, though I speak with those tongues, he said, I have that ability. But he says, if I do it with the wrong motivation, what's the motivation that we should speak the gospel with? Love. Love. He says it's going to be what? It's becoming a sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. What's another way to explain that? Just a bunch of noise. What he's saying is, I believe, to chapter 14, maybe it'll help us to understand it out a little bit more. As you get through 14, one thing that Paul mentions right towards the end of the chapter, he says that things need to be done decently and in order, right? Is anybody familiar with the Cane Ridge revival? What happened at Cane Ridge? There's a chapel there, still there, and they've preserved it. And so we've got to visit it before. And so I don't remember the dates, but do a little research on it if you have time. Google some things. But Cane Ridge, it was a big gospel meeting in a sense. But what they had is they had preachers and denominations from throughout the region. They all assembled at Cane Ridge there. And they had all these areas set up where all this preaching was being done. And so it was kind of like a festival almost. It was like a revival or gospel meeting. And that's where you see, it's part of the restoration movement, right? And so they talked about, they had all these people that were preaching all over the ridge. And people would move from one preacher to the rest, next listening to what they're saying, right? And so as you go, you could start to determine which ones were preaching and teaching truth and which ones weren't, right? Well, it's pretty interesting. But the way I feel is similar to that setting. When they came together for worship, you had all these people that wanted to speak in tongues. So they would stand up and say what they wanted to say when they wanted to say it. You think about the confusion of that, right? Okay. So verse 2, he says, though I have the gift of prophecy. Here he talks about the gift of prophecy, the gift of understanding mysteries, a gift of having knowledge, the gift of faith. He said, but if I don't have love, what? He says, nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. And this is, think about bestowing all my goods to feed the poor, but if I don't do it out of love. What happened to Ananias and Sapphira? What did they do? They lied, right? They sold their property and gave it to the church to take care of the poor. Why did they do that? Was it out of love for those Christians?
Show.
as a show. Right? He says, though I do that sort of thing, but I don't have love, then he says it profits me nothing. Okay? It won't add to my salvation. And I'm not talking about that we can build up as like our salvation like a bank account. But there's no reward for it. So then he talks in verses 4 through 8. He tells us about the characteristics of true love, agape love, right? And so when you look at it, he's telling the congregation, he said, there's division in the congregation, there's arguing in the congregation, there's confusion in the congregation, there's jealousy in the congregation, all these problems in the congregation. And what causes that? It's interesting, I visited with someone last night, and they said something that I never thought about, and I think is true, is jealousy is the sin that comes before hatred. You ever thought about that? I thought about that. I said, I think you might be right. Jealousy becomes before hatred. And what he was saying, he said a lot of times the people we hate or dislike is because they have something that we want. So because we can't get it, we're just going to dislike them, which is hatred, right? Okay. So he says, love suffers long. Agape suffers long. What's it mean to suffer long? Means we're just going to put up with them, right? You just put up with it. It suffers long. You just bear. And not only are you going to suffer long, but during it, it is, what's it say? Kind, right? And I'm going to say I struggle with these probably as much or more than you do, right? But when we have to suffer through somebody or something, is it hard to be kind? Yeah, sometimes, most of the time, right? So we say love suffers long and is kind. Then love does not envy. And that's what I guess I mentioned just a moment ago about the idea of sometimes our hatred is a result of jealousy, right? So, love does not envy. What was the problem with the church? People said, I want that gift. And if I don't get that gift, we're going to have problems in the congregation, right? Envy. Love does not parade itself. And so you think about the envy in contrast to parading itself, right? I think you look at this and you can look at two different individuals, right? Say, I'm not going to envy, but yet the person that has the gift isn't going to do what? I'm not going to show it. Yeah, boast about it. I'm not going to show it off. Well, look at, had an incident with the kids, right? One kid got in trouble, and then one said, ha ha, uh-oh. Guess who got in trouble? Both of them, right? That's what happens. So love doesn't envy, but the love doesn't parade itself. It's not puffed up. And so Paul says, if you have the gift, no big deal. Don't make a big deal about it. If you want the gift, so what? Don't make a big deal about it. Verse 5. Love does not behave. What's the King? Does anybody have the King James still? Rudely. Okay. It's same in the New King James. I couldn't remember. It's rudely, right? It does not seek its.
Oh, no, mine is New King.
Okay.
Which verse?
Verse 5.
Its own way.
What's that?
It does not insist on its own way.
Insist on its own way. Yeah. So it does not behave rudely. It does not seek its own, and is not provoked. And you think about that. Will people provoke us? Whose sin is that? It's theirs until we make it our own, right? And so, I was told growing up, and I'm afraid it's true, but at the time I didn't think it was. How many does it take to argue? So, in going through this, I've read this who knows how many times. But really for this morning study, as we prepare this, I thought, I never really understood that Paul it's as if he's talking to two people, right? We always read through this list, say, yeah, I understand that. But it's Paul's talking to these two individuals that aren't getting along. You have the gift, you don't have the gift. Right? If you have the gift, don't make a big deal about it. If you don't have the gift, don't be jealous about it. Right? Both get along about it. He's looking, so no matter who you are in the congregation, whether you have or have not, Paul says, get over it. Right? Just get over it. So, it does not seek its own, it's not provoked, and it thinks no evil. Right? That's the hard one. What's it mean to think no evil? Love does not think.
To think bad things about a person.
I know they're up to no good. Right? That's the mind. I know they're up to no good.
Some of these things, you know, you say get over it, it's reflex, you know, you kind of.
Reactionary.
Reactionary, you're like, oh, I shouldn't
That's
have felt
right.
that way. And
Mm-hmm.
so, you know, it's just something to think about.
Yep. So we don't look down on others. We don't think they're up to no good. It does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in truth. Sometimes we say, well, I hope they get what's coming to them. Well, the problem is, if they get what's coming to them, we probably deserve to get what's coming to us. And that's not always good for us, so we need to think about that. Love bears all things, it believes all things, it hopes all things, it endures all things. Love never fails, but whether there are prophecies, they will fail. Whether there are tongues, they will cease. Whether there's knowledge, they'll vanish away. In verse 8, he's telling the congregation, here, you're trying to build the congregation up and make the miraculous so important that you forgot about everything else. You can't see the forest through the trees. He said, you have these miraculous gifts now, but what will you not have someday? The miraculous. Why? Because in verse 9, Paul says, for now we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect has come, then that which is in part will be done away. He's talking about once the final book of the Bible is written, the all scripture that Paul talks about when writing to Timothy in the second letter. When that comes, once it's all here, the Bible is completed, what's going to fade away? The special gifts. And so they were trying to build the congregation, divide the congregation on the miraculous, and Paul said that won't even be here in several years. And it would be several years down the road before it happened. But he said you need to find a better foundation than something that's going to disappear, right? If we build a good foundation, will the foundation outlast the house? And he said you're trying to build a congregation on a foundation that won't be there. So, Paul said, when I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. What's he accusing the Corinthian brethren of being? Ignorant, childish, right? He said, you're acting like a bunch of children. So, we're almost out of time and we didn't get as far as we needed to be. He said in chapter 14, pursue love. Verse 13, he said, is the end of the chapter, now abideth faith, hope, love, but the greatest of these is what? Love. The miraculous was an important tool for the establishment of the early church. What have we replaced the miraculous with? The written word. That's why we don't have it anymore. That's why it's faded away. It's gone. We have this to replace it. But Paul says, pursue love and desire spiritual gifts, but especially that you may prophesy. So here he's still telling them it's okay to desire the spiritual gifts, but what was the most important one? The prophecy. As we talked about a couple weeks ago, that was the word that was going to be written and recorded for us, right? They had that, those principles, those teachings, that education. So, we got 2 minutes left. Jump ahead to the end of chapter 14. Verse 37, if anyone thinks himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him acknowledge that the things which I write to you are the commandments of the Lord. But if anyone is ignorant, let him be ignorant. Therefore, brethren, desire earnestly to prophesy, And do not forbid to speak with tongues, but let all things be done how? Yeah. Their worship service was some kind of a chaotic event because of the division that was happening because of what they desired. And so he said, we've got to let all these things go so we can focus on what? When we think about the prophecy, today we'll say preaching and teaching, right? This is a period of prophecy. What do we use to do that? The Bible, not the miraculous. We've replaced that. And so, what teaches a person to become a Christian? The gospel, right? The prophecy, right? And we understand it's not a miraculous prophecy today. It's what we've been given through written word. That's what builds church. So what makes Christians? Prophecy. What builds a church? Christians. What builds families? What builds nations? Not the speaking of tongues, not the other. And you think about that. What they had, what they desired in the first century was they wanted their worship service to be a flash, a bang, a show. Right? That's what they were turning religion into today. And this is kind of where we wanted to get. And I know we're 30 seconds past. Aaron's ready to kill us back there with the button. But here's the thing. What have many people turned religion into today? The same thing. A flash, a bang, a show. Right? So we think about those things. All right. Any questions or comments? All right. Thank you for your time.